The billionaire pretended to go on a trip, then discovered what the nanny was really doing to his kids. The gates of the Whitmore estate opened without fanfare, as they always did. No one questioned the blacked-out sedan that passed through. Sir Charles Whitmore made sure of that. His return was meant to be a secret. From the outside, the estate was its usual pristine image. 3 acres of manicured lawn, ivy-wrapped columns, and a grand Georgian facade that whispered old money, though Charles had made his fortune in clean tech. The air smelled of early autumn, crisp, dry leaves with a hint of coming frost. He stepped out of the car alone, a leather duffel slung over his shoulder, and took the narrow side path toward the servants' entrance. It was ridiculous, he knew, like sneaking into his own fortress. But this was no ordinary visit. Charles had told everyone he'd be gone for a week in Zurich, meetings, investors, strategy. In truth, he'd flown just far enough to fake a passport stamp, spent one night in New York and returned on a red-eye with a single objective: catch the new nanny in the act. Her name was Lily, young, unconventional, recommended by a boutique agency with more optimism than results. She was the 6th nanny in 7 months. Too soft, Dorothy had said. The boys need structure, not fairy tales and finger paint. Dorothy had served the Whitmore household since before Charles's sons were born. Her word carried weight, especially now, with things unraveling. Lucas had grown quiet, withdrawn, and Ben. Sweet, struggling Ben still didn't walk without assistance. Since his wife's death last winter, the boys had become shadows. So Charles did what he always did when things slipped out of control. He tightened his grip. Structure, schedules, staff, dismissals, and now suspicion. The corridor was dark, lit only by thin strips of late-morning sun cutting through high windows. Charles moved like a man expecting betrayal. Each step was soundless, practiced. If Lily was irresponsible, unprofessional, inappropriate, he'd see it with his own eyes. He paused outside the family room door. Voices, soft ones. Then laughter, light and high-pitched, so unfamiliar in this house it stopped him cold. He edged the door open. What he saw made his breath catch. Lily was on the floor, wearing jeans and a loose blue sweater, her hair in a messy ponytail. Cushions and blankets were sprawled everywhere, forming a crooked but ambitious pillow fort. Lucas peeked from behind a flap of fabric, aiming a foam dart at her head. Ben sat cross-legged on a rug, giggling uncontrollably. There was no tablet in sight, no educational toy, no script, just joy. Lily lunged playfully at Lucas, who shrieked and disappeared into the fort. She laughed, loud and unfiltered. Then she turned to Ben, held out her hand and said, "Captain Ben, we need backup." Ben grinned so wide it almost split his face. "Aye, aye, Lily." Charles couldn't move. For a moment he wasn't the man in charge. He was a ghost, watching strangers live inside the shell of his family. His throat tightened. His eyes burned. The scene ripped something open in him. Grief, first and foremost. For the life he had lost. For the wife who used to fill these walls with the same kind of laughter. Then came jealousy. How dare this woman, this outsider, create a world his sons would rather live in than the one he built? And underneath it all, shame. He didn't understand his own children anymore. He stepped fully into the room, and his voice came out sharper than intended. "What exactly is going on here?" Lily froze mid-crawl. Lucas ducked back into the fort. Ben scrambled to his feet, startled. Lily stood slowly, brushing hair from her flushed face. "Sir Charles, I didn't expect—" "That much is clear." He scanned the mess. "Is this what passes for supervision now? Turning my living room into a daycare jungle gym?" Lily blinked. "We were just playing, sir. They need structure," he cut in, his voice low but dangerous. "Boundaries, not chaos." Ben stepped closer to Lily, clutching her hand. "Dad," Lucas said from behind a pillow wall, his voice small. "We were happy," Charles faltered, but the tight knot in his chest refused to loosen. Dorothy appeared behind him, as if summoned by tension. Her expression was calm. Too calm. "I warned you, sir. She doesn't follow the household routines." Lily turned to her. "With respect, Dorothy, I do. But these boys—" "You're dismissed," Charles said, his tone final. "What?" Lily whispered. "You may gather your things. Your employment here is over," Lucas cried out. Ben clung harder to her hand. "Please don't go." Lucas burst from the fort, his cheeks red and wet. "She makes us laugh. She makes Ben try to walk." Lily looked to Charles, her eyes shining but proud. "I've done nothing wrong. I care about them. You're done," Charles said through clenched teeth, unable to meet her eyes. "Go." She nodded once, jaw tight, and knelt to hug both boys. Ben's small arms wrapped around her neck like a lifeline. Lucas sobbed openly. "I'm sorry," Lily whispered, holding them both. "Be brave, my loves." Charles stood motionless as she left the room. The sound of the front door closing echoed like a slap. Dorothy began tidying the mess with smug efficiency. Charles didn't help, didn't speak. That night the house was silent. No stories, no pillow forts, no laughter. Just the soft, distant sound of Ben crying himself to sleep. And Charles awake in his study, staring at a photograph of his late wife, wondering when the house had stopped feeling like home. The next morning the sun rose, but the house stayed dark. Lucas didn't come downstairs for breakfast. Ben sat at the table in silence, pushing a spoon around his untouched oatmeal. The dining room, usually echoing with footsteps, staff chatter, and the occasional outburst of childlike rebellion, felt like a museum. Cold, preserved, hollow. Dorothy poured a cup of tea for herself, not even bothering to ask the boys what they wanted. "Children need consistency," she muttered to no one in particular. "That girl coddled them. No discipline, no structure. This is what happens." Charles stood at the head of the table, reading the headlines on his tablet without absorbing a word. He didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't look at his sons. It was easier that way. That afternoon, he held interviews with 2 candidates from the agency. The first was a certified behavioral therapist with an alphabet of credentials after her name. The second arrived in a tailored suit, quoting parenting psychology like a textbook. He hired the second one. By sundown, she had resigned. "They won't talk to me," she told Charles with a stiff smile, collecting her handbag. "They just cried in separate rooms. I'm not equipped for this kind of attachment disruption." Charles didn't argue. He didn't even walk her to the door. Upstairs, Lucas sat in his mother's reading chair, curled under a faded quilt. He stared blankly out the window, ignoring his father's attempt at conversation. Ben hadn't spoken all day. By evening, Dorothy found him asleep on the floor beside Lily's now empty room. It was 2 days later when the first flashback came, not in Charles's memory, but in the form of a drawing. He was walking past the music room when something colourful caught his eye. A sheet of paper taped to the wall, one he didn't remember approving. He peeled it off. Crayon strokes covered the page, a crooked rainbow, stick figures holding hands, 2 small ones labelled L and B, a taller one labelled Lily. At the bottom, scrawled in Ben's shaky handwriting, "Thank you for helping me be brave." Charles stared at the drawing far longer than he intended. He remembered the day Lily had arrived. Dorothy had greeted her stiffly, inspecting her boots for mud before letting her cross the threshold. Charles hadn't even been home. He was on a red-eye to San Francisco, securing funding for a hydrogen energy patent. By the time he returned, Lily had already done something none of the others could: get Ben to smile. Must be a fluke, he'd thought at the time. But it wasn't. She'd started with eye contact, not instructions. She never forced routines, she invited them. Instead of structured sessions, she made obstacle courses out of couch cushions. She told Lucas bedtime stories she made up on the spot, and he started writing his own endings in a notebook. Ben had once been terrified of staircases. She turned them into mountain adventures. Lucas wouldn't eat vegetables. She made dinosaur dips out of carrots and hummus. Charles had noticed it, of course, but he mistook their growing comfort for danger, a threat to his authority. And now? Now the house felt like it was grieving someone who hadn't died. One rainy afternoon, 3 days after Lily's departure, a knock came at the staff entrance. Dorothy answered. It was a young woman, early 20s, wearing a denim jacket and holding a folded sweater. "I'm sorry to drop by," she said, shifting nervously. "I'm Lily's friend, Maya. She left this behind, and she didn't want to come back to get it herself, so—" I offered. Dorothy's eyes narrowed. "Leave it here. I'll see that it's returned." Maya hesitated, then reached into her tote bag. "There's also something Ben made for her. I found it in her backpack. Thought she'd want to keep it." Dorothy took the folded paper with a tight-lipped nod. "Of course. I'll take care of it." The door closed, but Dorothy didn't deliver the items to Charles. She shoved them into a kitchen drawer and forgot about them. Until that night, when Charles, unable to sleep, went searching for chamomile tea. He opened the drawer and pulled out the wrong box. Inside, under spare batteries and a stack of menus, was a pale blue construction paper card. Glued on macaroni outlined a heart. In the center, written in uneven letters, "To Lily, you're my best day." Ben Charles sat down at the kitchen table and read it again. And again. It hit him harder than he expected. Not just the words, the meaning, the simplicity, the honesty. Ben couldn't tie his shoes without help, but he could articulate love better than Charles could. For the first time since Lily walked out that door, Charles felt doubt. The next morning, he made his coffee in silence. Lucas and Ben were already dressed. Dorothy was, as usual, measuring cereal with military precision. Charles reached into the drawer, took the card, and placed it on the table. Ben's eyes widened. "That's mine." "I found it," Charles said quietly. "In the kitchen." Lucas leaned over to see it. His mouth pressed into a line. Ben said, "It's for Lily." "I know." Charles stared at the card for a long time before asking, "Did she help you write it?" Ben shook his head. "I did it myself. She said I could do big things if I practiced." Lucas looked up. "You made her leave?" It wasn't a question. Charles didn't answer. He just stood, picked up his coffee, and walked to the window. Outside, the leaves had started to fall. Inside, the silence was starting to speak. The camera didn't lie. That thought struck Charles somewhere between guilt and disbelief as he stared at the paused frame on his monitor. There it was, grainy but clear. The nursery playroom. The timestamp in the corner read 3:14 p.m. from nearly 2 weeks ago. Lily knelt in front of Ben, her hands held out like wings, her voice soft and steady. Ben stood, wobbled, and walked, 4 whole steps. Charles leaned forward, replaying the footage again and again, like watching a miracle he hadn't believed in until now. Ben had walked, not during a therapy session, not with professional scaffolding or hand-holding techniques. Just Lily, and a game where he was a baby giraffe learning to stand. No braces, no pressure, just play and trust. Charles sat back in his leather chair, the office cold despite the fireplace flickering behind him. The flames popped, but he didn't move. Couldn't. His mind reeled with images of that day, how he'd barged in, humiliated Lily, sent her away in front of the boys. He'd missed this moment. Worse, he'd erased it. He opened another clip. Same day. Later in the evening. This time from the hallway camera. Ben, exhausted but beaming, clutching Lily's hand. Lily whispering something in his ear. Ben nodding. Charles fast-forwarded through the night logs, not really expecting more. But what he found next changed everything. Dorothy, caught on camera in the west corridor, moments after Charles had gone to bed the same night. Ben was crying softly. Dorothy stood beside him, stiff and unmoving. She didn't kneel, didn't comfort. Instead, she turned sharply and walked away, muttering under her breath. Charles rewound, slowed the audio. Enough of this nonsense. She hadn't even touched him. Another clip. 2 weeks earlier, one of the previous nannies, Ms. Brower, attempting to get Lucas to eat dinner. Dorothy interrupts, takes the spoon, and loudly tells the boy, "You'll eat when I say, not when she plays chef." Charles blinked. Then another clip. Ms. Brower again, storming out the front door with tears in her eyes. The pattern began to surface. He pulled up the personnel archive. 7 names, 7 dismissals, each one labeled with terms like incompetent, overly familiar, unreliable. Each evaluation written, fully or in part, by Dorothy. He sat back, staring at the screen like it might rearrange itself into something less damning. But the data didn't lie either. Dorothy had been sabotaging his household for months, maybe longer, and he had let her, trusted her, because it was easier. Easier to let someone else control the domestic chaos. Easier to believe he was protecting his sons by maintaining order, even if that order came at the cost of affection, creativity, life. He stood abruptly and crossed to the window. Rain had started to fall, faint but steady. The garden below blurred beneath it just like his thoughts. There were too many apologies he couldn't make, too many chances he hadn't taken, but there was one he might still salvage. The call to Lily was brief. "I have your final check," he said flatly. "You left before receiving it. I'd like to hand it to you personally." There was a pause on the other end, a long one. "I can have it mailed," she said finally, cautious. "I'd prefer in person, if that's all right." Another pause. "Fine." She hung up before he could say anything else. Lily arrived the next afternoon, dressed simply in a wool coat and scarf, her hair damp from the drizzle outside. She carried herself like someone bracing for another blow. Charles met her in the front foyer. He tried to speak, but she held up a hand. "If this is about re-employment, let me stop you now. I'm not coming back." He nodded slowly. "I figured, but I still needed to say something." She crossed her arms. "Go ahead." He reached into his coat pocket and held out the card. Ben's card, the one with the macaroni heart and crooked handwriting. Lily's eyes flickered. "You found it." "Dorothy tried to hide it, along with your sweater, and a dozen truths I never bothered to look for." She looked away, jaw tight. "I watched the security footage," Charles said. "I saw Ben walk. I saw you, how you worked with them, how you brought them back to life." Lily didn't answer. "I saw Dorothy too," he added, "and I realize now I've let her run this house like a mausoleum. I thought order would save my sons, but it was never order they needed." She took the card from his hand carefully, as if touching a memory too fragile to hold. He stepped back to give her space. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I do regret how I treated you, how quickly I chose control over compassion." Lily looked up at him, and for a moment, something in her expression cracked, but then it hardened again. "Apology accepted," she said, "but I'm not going to be your fix, not again. I came into that house every day with an open heart. I left it shattered." Charles nodded once. No protest, no plea. "You're right," he said. "I hope someday, if you're willing, you'll let me fix that." She nodded slightly, then, without another word, turned and walked back into the rain. He watched her go until she was gone from view. And for the first time in months, he didn't turn away from the pain, he stood in it. It started with a brooch, a small sapphire pin that had once belonged to Charles's late wife, rarely worn. Kept in a velvet box in the upstairs study, not especially valuable compared to the rest of the estate's holdings, but deeply sentimental. That's why Dorothy chose it, and that's why Charles let her. He had told her just that morning, over tea in the formal dining room, that he planned to interview another nanny, a woman Lily had recommended from her former school. Dorothy barely concealed her displeasure. "She's manipulating you from a distance," she said calmly, slicing into her toast. "First your children, now your staff." Charles said nothing, just nodded, just waited, because this time the house was watching. The cameras had been running for weeks, but now they were strategically positioned. Study, hallway, staff kitchen, even the mudroom, where most personal bags were left on a bench by the lockers. By early afternoon, Charles sat in his office with the live feeds open, pretending to review a quarterly report. His hands trembled, but not from nerves, from focus. And there she was, Dorothy, moving through the study with deliberate ease. No hesitation. She opened the glass cabinet, removed the brooch, tucked it into her sleeve. 15 minutes later, she approached the mudroom. No one else around. Lily's tote bag, returned earlier that week after a kind-hearted housemaid had found it in storage, sat neatly on the bench. Dorothy glanced both ways. Then she slipped the brooch inside. The door clicked shut behind her. "Got you." "Dorothy," Charles said from the top of the stairs as she returned to the main hall, brushing invisible dust from her apron. She turned, startled, composed herself quickly. "Yes, sir? Can you join me in the office?" She followed, her posture perfect, hands folded like she was entering a courtroom she'd already won. Charles gestured to the screen behind his desk, paused at the exact moment her hand slid into the tote. Dorothy's face went still. "I'd like to hear your explanation," he said quietly. She didn't speak. "I've reviewed weeks of footage," he continued. "I know about the nannies before Lily. I know what you've been doing. But this was a step too far." Her mouth twitched, but no words came. "You're fired, Dorothy. Effective immediately. There will be a formal investigation, and I suggest you leave the property before the children return." Her composure cracked, just for a second, but it was enough. She turned without another word and walked out of the room. The silence she left behind was the cleanest sound the house had made in years. That evening, Charles did something he hadn't done in months. He cooked dinner, or at least he tried. The pasta was overboiled, the sauce was uneven, and the garlic bread nearly burned. But Lucas and Ben didn't seem to care. They sat at the kitchen island, legs swinging, watching their father fumble with pots and spices. "You're not very good at this," Lucas said, grinning. "I'm aware," Charles replied, tossing a wooden spoon over his shoulder like it offended him. Ben giggled. Later, he sat them both down in the den, not on the leather chairs or the pristine carpet, on the floor, cross-legged at eye level. "I need to tell you something," Charles said. The boys looked up. "I made a mistake when I sent Lily away. A big one." Lucas's brow furrowed. "But she's not coming back, right?" "Not unless she wants to," Charles said. "But I'm going to ask her." Ben's eyes lit up. "Really?" Charles nodded. "Because this house doesn't feel like home without her, and because I think we were all better when she was here." Lucas said nothing, but he didn't argue. Lily arrived the next morning, not for work, not for duty, but because Charles had called and asked, honestly, humbly, if she would come speak to the boys. He met her at the door himself, without a tie or jacket, just a soft sweater and the first smile she'd ever seen him wear without tension behind it. "I owe you a proper apology," he said before she could speak. She raised an eyebrow. "Another one? This one's different." He opened the door wider. She stepped inside. Lucas was already peeking from behind the hallway wall. Ben stood in the middle of the living room, holding something in his hands. It was a pillow, the first piece of a fort. "Will you help us build it again?" he asked. Lily glanced at Charles. He nodded. "I'd like to help too, if I'm allowed." For a moment, no one moved. Then Lily walked forward, dropped her coat, and took the pillow from Ben's hands. "I think we're going to need more blankets." It wasn't perfect. The blankets didn't match. The chairs leaned at odd angles. Someone used a broomstick to hold up the roof. And halfway through, the whole thing collapsed when Lucas cannonballed into it. But the laughter that followed, it was real, loud, messy, alive. Charles didn't sit on the couch and watch. He was on the floor, dodging foam darts, holding up corners of the roof while Ben taped stars made of construction paper to the ceiling. Lily sat beside him, her legs folded under her, smiling without walls. At one point, Ben climbed into Charles's lap, something he hadn't done since before the funeral, and whispered, "I'm glad you brought her back." Charles swallowed hard. "Me too, buddy." Later that night, as the boys fell asleep inside their blanket fortress, Charles turned to Lily. "I don't want you back as a nanny." Her smile faded. "I want you back as part of this family, whatever that looks like to you, however long it takes." She looked at the boys, then back at him, and for the first time she didn't hesitate.